We've said this often in our preaching, and we'll say it again this morning, but unfortunately, difficulty and hardships are part of all of our lives. If they're not part of your life, you can leave this morning because my message will have nothing to do with you. But if you have had hardship and difficulty, stick around and join the rest of us, because unfortunately those are part of all of our lives, and they have been that way ever since the fall of man. Remember, in our road trip series that we're in through the Bible, we saw where all of that came from in Genesis chapter 3. And ever since the fall of man in Genesis 3, hardship and difficulty have been a part of every human being's life. And I started this week to put with the exception of Jesus, and I thought, well, that would be silly, because Jesus accomplished or went through a lot of hardship. And if we don't believe that, read through the Gospels. Jesus' life was one hardship after another. It was one difficulty after another. And it continued that way right up to the point that he was hung on the cross. And so even Jesus faced hardship and difficulty as he went through the various aspects of his life. Unfortunately, we will get sick. Unfortunately, we will lose loved ones. Unfortunately, we will struggle financially. Unfortunately, we will have accidents. Unfortunately, we will be wronged. Unfortunately, we will struggle relationally. Unfortunately, we will struggle in our workplaces. We will struggle in our communities. Unfortunately, we will be betrayed and we will be hurt. And all of these things, unfortunately, will be a part of our lives. And as a rule, there's nothing we can do to completely change that. Oh, we can avoid some of those things. I realize that, and I'm not saying that our choices don't matter. They do. But unfortunately, any or all of those things will be a part of our lives in one way or other our entire lives. We never totally avoid any of the hardships or difficulties that we face in life. But here's a question I want us to think about this morning. What if we faced all of those things with the belief, the knowledge, and the understanding that God is going through those things with us? What if in any of the struggles that I faced in life, what if I really believed that God was going through that difficult time with me, and that God would work in that difficult time? What if I really, really believed that? Now, I realize this morning if I was to ask that right where at church, everybody would raise their hand, me included, and say, yep, I believe wholeheartedly that God goes through any hardship with me. We all say that. But how many of us really believe that? And if we really believe that, how does that make a difference in our struggles? How does that make us look at our struggles differently? How does that make us deal with our struggles differently? How does it matter how we pray about those things when we're struggling with those things? What difference does that make in our lives? In theory, it would give us strength. It would give us wisdom. It would give us peace. It would cause us to look and say, okay, if God's working and God's here, what is He trying to accomplish? And how is He going to work? In theory, if we really believe that, all of that is true. All of that is true. Unfortunately, as we've said already, bad things happen to good people. And sometimes really good things happen to really bad people. And we can't explain that. I can't come up with the answers to those things, and I've given up even trying at times. But what if we stopped constantly asking God to take away our hardships and difficulties and started asking God to work in those things and started to look for God to work in those things? How much difference would that make in everything that we experience going through those things? Again, if we just stopped saying, God, take them away, and started saying, God, use them. And help me to see and understand what you're doing in the midst of those things. What kind of difference might that make in our lives? Might make more difference than we realize. Might matter more than we realize as we begin to look at those things differently. Well, this morning you've guessed already, but I want to look at the life of Joseph. We're introduced to Joseph in Genesis chapter 30. You remember, if you were here last week, we talked about the battle that went on in the family of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And if you remember the battle that took place between Jacob's wives, Rachel and Leah. And it was a real battle to see who could have the most kids and the most boys and the most often. And man, they were butting heads for about a chapter and a half, if you remember right. It was almost embarrassing to see the battle that went on in that family. Well, we're introduced to Joseph in the middle of that. In Genesis chapter 30, beginning in verse 23, it says, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her, and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, May the Lord add to me another son." If you remember, Rachel was really the wife that Jacob wanted. She was his favorite wife of the wives that he had, and she was barren. Now, Jacob had children with her, if you remember from last week, through her handmaid, and they were looked at as her children, and so on and so forth. But finally, she was able to become pregnant, and she gave birth to Joseph. And that was her first natural-born son. Later on, she had another son, Benjamin, but she died during childbirth. And so Joseph and Benjamin were really the only two natural-born sons that Jacob had through Rachel. In Genesis chapter 37, we skip ahead, we fast forward ahead a ways in Joseph's life. And we read a few things here that are important for us to understand about Joseph. We see in verse 4, let's read a few of these verses. It says, Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojourners in the land of Canaan. This is in Genesis 37. And these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and they could not speak peaceably to him. Now we learned a number of things here that are important about Joseph. First of all, we see that he was his father's favorite son. What did I say last week would destroy a family faster than anything else? Favoritism. And you would have thought Jacob would have recognized that. And probably he did, but that didn't stop him from favoring Joseph. Of all of the children that he had, Joseph was his favorite son. And it's pretty obvious that he didn't hide it. It was well known that Jacob loved Joseph more than anybody else. It was not hidden. We also see in verse 2 that Joseph, and you can take this however you want, Joseph was a tattletale. In regards to his brothers, he was a tattletale. He saw his brothers doing something wrong, and you can agree that he should have, and you can argue that he shouldn't have. But Joseph went home and said to his father, Dad, look, here is what my brothers are doing. They're supposed to be watching the sheep, but they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. Well, how did that make his brothers feel? Not well. Not well. The Bible says they hated him so much they couldn't even speak peaceably to him. They hated him. They couldn't stand their younger brother. In verse 4, I just said, he was absolutely hated by his brothers. Back up to verse 3, we see that Joseph had special privileges given to him by his dad. He had a robe or a coat of many colors. That coat of many colors was a status symbol. It was a matter of privilege. It got him out of many responsibilities. That coat of many colors belonged to the oldest son, not one of the younger sons. It belonged to the favored son, the blessed son, the son that had his father's blessing. That coat of many colors, as I said, got him out of many responsibilities. While the brothers were all out watching sheep, where was Joseph? He must have been with them on occasion because he tattled on them. But we see later on that he was home with his father. He was home with his dad. He was being favored. He was being given special privileges that the others did not have. Now, skip ahead here in Genesis chapter 37 to verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field. And behold, my sheaf rose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, these next several verses are vital, I believe, to our understanding of this whole account that we're going to talk about. Joseph is having a dream. And in Joseph's day, God spoke to his people in dreams. The Bible was not written. Joseph could not go to the Bible and say, "Well, let me see what God says." Couldn't do that. God spoke to people in dreams. If you remember, how did God promise to Abraham that he would have Isaac and so forth? He spoke to him in a dream. Now, there were times that he appeared to them, but he spoke to them in dreams. And so this dream is literally God speaking to Joseph. And I believe that we have to understand it that way to follow with the rest of my message this morning. God is speaking to Joseph. And God is saying to Joseph, "Joseph, I have a plan for your life. There's something, Joseph, that I am going to do in you. And I am going to bring about my plan. I am going to use you, Joseph, in a special way." Joseph's dream. Joseph dreams that he and his brothers are out binding sheaves in the field. Now, I don't know why sheaf can be any type of grain. I always think corn stalks. But it can be wheat or oats or whatever else. But I always think corn stalks. And I don't know what it was they were doing here, but they were out binding up their sheaves. They were, in a sense, they were cutting down the corn stalks and they were tying them up. And they're all out working together in the field. And for whatever reason, all of his brothers' sheaves that they are binding come over, and Joseph's sheaf stands upright. It stands tall. And his brothers' sheaves all begin to bow down to the sheaf that Joseph is binding. Now, to his brothers, there's no question to the meaning of that dream. They become very angry. Do you really think, Joseph, that someday we're going to bow down to you? Someday we're going to worship you? Joseph, you're nuts. See, they understood what the dream meant. And you can argue whether Joseph should or shouldn't have told them. I have no idea. I can be swayed either way as to whether he should have told them. But the point here is, the brothers recognized that the dream meant that someday Joseph would rule. And someday they would bow down to him. Now, they didn't like that. They didn't accept that. But there was no question as to that's what the dream meant. God was speaking to Joseph. We go on, beginning in verse 9. Joseph dreamt another dream. And again, he told it to his brothers. And he said, "I have dreamed another dream." And you can almost hear the brothers saying, "Oh, great, here we go again. What does this kid think?" And he said, "Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." Why do you think there was 11 stars? He had 11 brothers. He had 11 brothers. This is not even a subtle message here. The 11 stars, they bowed down to me. But when it was told to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow ourselves to the ground before you?" Now, notice here his dad seems to be arguing with him. "Joseph, come on, what are you thinking? This isn't going to happen." That's almost what he's saying, but that's not what he believes. If you read verse 11, his brothers were jealous, but his father kept the saying in mind. What does that mean? His father knew there was more here than a dream. His father knew that God was speaking to Joseph. And his father understood that God was saying to Joseph, there's something that I am going to do in you. There's some way that I am going to use you. Joseph, I think, understood that message. I don't think he understood the details of it. I'm not saying that. But I think he understood what God was saying to him. And Joseph's dad understood what God was saying to Joseph. They knew that God was going to use him. And I'm going to speculate here a little bit based on my knowledge of the rest of the story in Genesis. But I believe that Joseph lived his life in anticipation of the fact that God was going to do what he said he was going to do. I believe that Joseph lived the rest of his life looking back at God's message here and saying, I don't know the details, but I know that God has promised to use me. And so at that point on, Joseph began to live knowing that whatever happened in his life, God was at work. And God would work to bring about his plan for Joseph's life. Now, I want to take a break here for a minute from the story of Joseph. I want to think about how that might apply to our lives. I believe today that in some way, as a child of God, we all have similarly the same promise that God gave to Joseph. Now, I don't believe that God is going to raise each of us up and make us a ruler of a nation or that type of thing. But I do believe that as a Christian, we have the promise in Scripture that as we know Christ, He will never leave us or forsake us. Which means that He will be with us no matter what we struggle with and no matter what we face in our lives. And I do believe wholeheartedly that God has a purpose and a plan for each of our lives. God's plan for me is different than God's plan for you. But that makes my purpose no more important than your purpose. God has a purpose. God is working in our lives to bring about His plan and what He desires in our lives. And just like nothing would hinder God from bringing about that plan in Joseph, nothing will hinder God's working out His plan in our lives either. Here's a couple of verses of Scripture. Hebrews chapter 13. He says, keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For He, Jesus, has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Okay? Now, notice the confidence that he gives in that verse. I can say without a doubt that God will never leave me nor forsake me. Therefore, whatever I face in life, what harm can that bring to me? How can that hurt me? How can that destroy me? The idea here is it can never destroy what God is doing in your life. It may hurt, I may suffer, there may be pain, there may be death. But that will not stop what God is doing in my life. That will not stop what God desires to accomplish and do in my life. Another familiar verse with a couple added in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. Paul says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to His purpose. For those whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, in order that He might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom He predestined, He also called. And those whom He called, He also justified. And those whom He justified, He also glorified. What is He saying in that verse? God saved us for a reason. God saved us for a purpose. And there is nothing that will happen in our lives that God will not use to bring about His purpose and His plan. Whatever happens in our lives, sickness, loss, pain, financial difficulty, hardship, whatever happens in our lives, in some way God will use to bring about His plan and His purpose in our lives. It will not hinder what God is doing in our lives. This morning, I believe that Joseph knew that same thing. As God spoke to him in a dream, God was saying to Joseph, number one, I am with you. Number two, I will use everything that comes into your life to bring you to where I want you to be. And number three, I will accomplish what I want to accomplish in your life. What was Joseph's part in that? To believe that, to hang on to that, and remain faithful to God. And what we're going to see this morning in Joseph's life, in summary form, is that Joseph does just that. You know, it's very easy. It's very easy to claim that kind of promise when everything's going well in our lives. When we pay our bills, and we have extra, and we're healthy, and our family is going well, and our job is going well, and our community, everything is great. It's very easy, isn't it, to say, yep, God's with me. I believe that wholeheartedly. Boy, God is good. Really believe that. But then what happens when the hardship comes? We struggle with that. It's not as easy anymore. And you know, I believe Joseph is a great example of what it is to believe that even when things are going wrong. Now, let me begin to summarize. Kelly, I'll say it this morning. Buckle your seatbelts. Kelly told me last week I forgot to say, unbuckle your seatbelts. I think that's what you said at the end of the service. So buckle your seatbelts. We got 10 minutes and we're going to fly through the life of Joseph. Because Joseph's life was a great example of a man that believed God was with him and that God was in charge. Now, when we're introduced to Joseph here in Genesis 37, everything in Joseph's life seems to be going well. Now, I realize he lost his mother, and I'm not belittling that at all. That was a horrific thing. It had to have been for Joseph. But that was in the past. And at this point, as Joseph is living his life, everything is going very well. He's favored, he's blessed, he has privilege, he has hope, his father loves him. Everything in his life is going well. That was about to change very quickly. That was about to change very quickly. As I said already, Joseph's brothers hated him. And their hatred of Joseph and their jealousy of Joseph grew day by day. Every time they looked at Joseph, they hated him more. Every time he said, I had a dream, they hated him more. And they couldn't wait to do something to demonstrate their hatred for Joseph. One day, they were out watching their father's sheep. And Jacob called to Joseph. And he said, Joseph, I want you to go check on your brothers. And so Joseph went. And the first thing we know as we read through Genesis is that the brothers weren't where they were supposed to be. Now, that's probably why Jacob said to Joseph, go check on your brothers. He probably had an inkling that they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. And so he said, Joseph, go check on your brothers. Well, Joseph eventually found his brothers. And his brothers looked up and they saw Joseph coming from a long ways away. And they said, you know what? This is our opportunity. And I don't remember the exact wording, but in essence they said, yeah, here comes that dreamer. What are they referring to? Joseph's promise from God. Here comes this dreamer. This guy that thinks that God is going to use him and rule over us. Here is our chance to get rid of him. And so at some point they grabbed Joseph, they ripped his coat off, and they threw him in a pit in the ground, a well, a hole in the ground, and they left him there to die. Joseph's life is taking a sudden, unexpected turn for the worse. He's thrown into the ground, he's left there to die. Now, behind the scenes, God is working here. Reuben, his one brother, talked the others out of killing him. Now just leave him there. We see that the well they threw him in didn't have water in it. God is working. But don't think that's obvious to Joseph at this point. It's not. It's not. What is obvious to Joseph is his brothers hate him and his brothers left him in a hole in the ground to die. That's what's obvious to Joseph. The plan was to let him die there and to tell his father that they found his coat and some wild animal had probably eaten him and that he was gone. And the whole plan, in my opinion, would have worked. It would have worked. except God had spoken to Joseph years earlier in a dream and said, Joseph, I have a plan for you. And because God had a plan for Joseph, the plan of the brothers failed. The brothers threw him in a hole in the ground, and then to show their cold-hearted hatred for Joseph, they sat down and they ate their lunch. They sat down and ate their lunch as their brother's dying in a hole in the ground. And as they're eating lunch, they look up, and here comes a group of Ishmaelite traders, not traitors, traders. And they see this band of traders coming, and they have a selfish thought. Now, God is going to use their selfish thought. They have a selfish thought, and the thought is, hey, why should we let our brother die? He is our brother, after all. They did say that. He is our brother, after all. You know, it wouldn't be right to kill him. So let's sell him to the traders and make some money. We can't kill our brother, but we can sell him. We can make money off of him. And it says that they sold him to the Ishmaelite traders for 20 shekels of silver. The commentary that I looked at said that that was 8 ounces of silver. So I got online and I looked up the price of silver. The price of silver today is, or at least middle of the week, was $18.88 per ounce. Which means they sold their brother for $151. By today's standard. So they sold their brother. And so the traders took Joseph. They took him to Egypt and they sold him as a slave, as you are familiar, to a man named Potiphar, who was the Pharaoh's guard. Now, let's stop again. Let me ask you this. If you were in Joseph's shoes, what would your attitude be at this point? Why? God, why? How could you allow this to happen to me? What did I do? Did I do something wrong? We would be, in today's vernacular, we would be on Facebook putting, please pray for me, I'm suffering. Now, I'm not picking on anybody that does that. But we would do that, wouldn't we? We would say, I'm suffering, pray that this stops. That's what we would do. And we would call our friends and our Christian neighbors in church, and we would say, pray that this suffering goes away. I don't want to suffer. Where is God? We would be saying that. We would be thinking that. We would do everything in our power to try to get rid of the suffering that we were going through. But you know one thing that most of us would not do? One thing that most of us would not do is that we would not stop and recognize that God is with us. And we would not pray and say, Lord, carry me through this and work in this situation and do whatever it is that you see fit in my life. We would not do that, most of us. We would not. We would be looking to get out of it. Notice Joseph's reaction. Joseph fulfills every responsibility that Potiphar gave him. And he does it to the best of his ability. Now, I don't know about you, but what that says to me is Joseph's attitude was not one of self-pity. Joseph's attitude was, here I am, God is in charge, God is at work, I will do everything my slave owner, Potiphar, I'll do everything that he wants me to do. And I'll do it to the best of my ability, and I'll just trust that God's going to work. I'll do whatever I can. And so it says in Genesis that Potiphar recognized that God was with him. Potiphar recognized that God was with him. Joseph did everything to the best of his ability. Knowing that God was with him. Even an ungodly man like the Potiphar said, this guy is not the same slave that everybody else is. This guy has God with him. He acts it, he lives it, he believes it, he knows it. And it wasn't long before the Potiphar said, you know what? I don't even know what I have in my house anymore. Because Joseph just takes care of it. I can trust him, I can count on him. He said, it says the only thing Potiphar knew was the food that was put on his plate. And that's all he cared about. Because he completely trusted that Joseph would do the right thing with every responsibility that he had. Even though he was a slave in a foreign country and not where he wanted to be. How was Joseph rewarded for that? You know the story. How was he rewarded? Potiphar's wife said, pretty handsome looking young man. Pretty handsome looking guy. And you know what? I think that I want to commit adultery with this young man. That's pretty much what she said. And Joseph kept saying, no, stay away, that's not right. And one day the Potiphar's wife grabbed his coat and he ran away. And when Potiphar came home, she said, hey, look what your slave did. He tried to lay with me. Potiphar was angry. Guess what he did? How was Joseph rewarded for all of his faithful service to God? He was thrown in jail. He was locked in a dungeon. And so, how did he react? Threw a pity party, right? Had a fit. Got down in the dumps. Cried and said, I need to be out of here. This isn't fair. What's going on? He didn't do any of that. He took his situation, believed that God was in charge, and he did the same thing he did for the Potiphar. He began to fulfill all the responsibilities that the guards gave him. And pretty soon, the guards didn't even know what was going on because Joseph was doing their job. And they could trust him 100%. How was Joseph rewarded for that? He was forgotten in prison. He was forgotten. To make a long story short, he helped somebody out and he said, reward me when you get out of here. And the guy got out and forgot all about him. And so Joseph spent more time in prison. He was rewarded for his good behavior, right? He was locked up. He was left there. He was forgotten there. And yet, how did Joseph react to that? God is with me. God is working. I'm going to be faithful to where I am, and I'm going to keep serving God, and I'm going to keep looking and waiting for God to work. He recognized God's presence. Finally, the Pharaoh had a dream. And finally, somebody said, oh, I remember a fellow that can translate dreams. I know a guy, he's still in prison. And so they brought Joseph out of the prison. And the Pharaoh said, here's my dream. And Joseph said, nobody can interpret your dream except God. Except God. Now, the Pharaohs believed that they were gods. And so Joseph says to the Pharaoh, only God can interpret your dream. Only God can tell you what that means. And he said, let me tell you what God said. And the Pharaoh said, you know what, I need to reward you. You're going to be second in command over all of Egypt. You're going to be in control of the food supply. You're going to collect the extra, and when there's none, you're going to dole out to those that need food. You're going to be in charge. You're going to be in command. God had a plan for him. And throughout all of the hardships and the difficulties, God remained faithful. And Joseph believed God. And Joseph lived and worked and acted as if he knew God was in charge. Eventually, Joseph is doing his job one day. And he looks out at the crowd of people. And there stands his brothers. There stands his brothers. And you know the story. Guess what his brothers did? They get on their knees and they bowed down to Joseph. They had no idea who Joseph was. He was dead. He was gone. He was the guilty conscience that they struggled with from day to day, but they'd never see him again. Was God faithful to what he said? Did God work all of the things that Joseph experienced and bring about good? Did God accomplish what he wanted in those things? He absolutely did. And Joseph said it best in Genesis chapter 50 in the verses that we read earlier. Joseph said to his brothers, everything you did to me was meant for evil and harm. There wasn't an ounce of good motive in it at all. But God used every bit of it to bring this to pass. God used every bit of it to bring about the salvation of a lot of people. God worked. Now, our time is up this morning. But I have a really tall challenge for us this week. Here's what I want us to do this week. I want each of us to consider a difficult situation that you're struggling with right now. Think about a difficult situation that you're struggling with. It may be at work, maybe at home, maybe family, maybe community, maybe financial, maybe health, maybe relational. It doesn't really matter. Something that you are struggling with. And here's the challenge. It's not hard to come up with that. We all did that about that quick. But here's what I want us to do with it. I want us to stop praying this week that God would remove our problem. That's going to be the hard part. Stop praying for God to take away our problem. And stop asking that other people pray that God take away our problem. Begin asking this week for God to work in our problem or in our situation. Instead of praying daily, Lord, take away whatever I'm struggling with. Begin to pray, Lord, I pray today that you will use my struggle to accomplish what you want in my life. And don't just pray that way. Begin to look for what God is doing to accomplish that. Begin to see how God is using your struggle, your problem, to work in your life. And understand something. I think Joseph was a servant and a prisoner probably a long time before he saw what God was doing. Doesn't mean he didn't know that God was working, because I believe he did. But he kept looking, and he kept waiting, and he kept believing. And his attitude and his actions and everything demonstrated, God, you're in control. And I believe that. I'm going to practice it. That's a tall challenge. It's a tall challenge this week. But I believe that as we begin to do that, we will have a different attitude, a different spirit, and we will begin to see God work in ways that perhaps we have not seen in our lives in the past. But let's take a moment and bow for prayer. Our Father, we thank you this morning for the confidence that we have that Joseph had. Joseph believed that you were with him, and he believed that you would work in his life. Lord, we may never be the leaders of a nation. We may never bring about the salvation of millions of people. But Lord, you have promised that you will never leave us and that you will never forsake us. The same promise that Joseph grabbed a hold of. You have promised to work out your purpose and your plan in our lives. And Lord, there is nothing, no circumstance, no evil motive, no evil thought, no action, no hardship, no difficulty. There is nothing that can stand in the way of your fulfilling that promise. And Lord, I pray that in the midst of our difficulties, that we would stop looking to have them removed, and that we would look to see you work, and that we would look to see your strength and your peace and what you are doing in the midst of those struggles. And Lord, even if what you are doing is out of sight, I pray that we would hang on to it by faith. And Lord, that we would know that you are there just as you said you would be. Lord, make a difference in our lives even as we consider these things this week. We thank you in Jesus' name.